We'll get started with a video from COBA's President Elias Hussamuddin.
Good morning. My name is Elias Hussamuddin, and I am the president of the Correction Officers Benevolent Association, otherwise known as COBA. Welcome to today's panel discussion that focuses on the debate over the future of Rikers Island. The plan to close Rikers Island and to open 4 new borough jails at a cost of $10 billion over the next 10 years has become one of New York's most controversial issues over the last several years. Elected officials, criminal justice activists, and the mainstream media have all weighed in on why they support closing Rikers Island and opening new borough jails. Unfortunately, the reality is that closing the 9 jails on Rikers and opening 4 new jails is not as simple as they would have us believe. That is why the COBA felt it was important, in conjunction with City and State, to host today's panel to dig beneath the hype and examine what political conditions led us to where we are today. We specifically invited panelists who are well informed on the issues facing the city jail system. And unlike other forums on this topic, we deliberately invited panelists who disagree and who offer different opinions. 2 years ago, former New York State Supreme Court Justice Jonathan Littman led a 27-member commission that produced an 87-page report recommending the closure of Rikers Island within 10 years. Of the 27 members on the commission, only 2 had direct knowledge of the city's correction system. COBA was provided a copy of the commission's report only after it was published and made public. We'll leave the reason as for why we were excluded from this process for another day. But today, we want our position on the debate over closing Rikers to be unmistakably clear. Our number one priority is safety. Safe jails matter to us, and they should matter to every New Yorker. We are not interested in using the 420 acres of land on Rikers Island to expand LaGuardia's runway to increase flights, as the Littman Commission report suggests. We're not interested in using the land on Rikers Island to develop waste sewage plants, as the report suggests. We are not interested in using the land on Rikers to construct new solar energy plants, as the report suggests. While these plans may align well with the financial interest of the many of the real estate developers who served on the Littman Commission, they have absolutely nothing to do with any plan to make the jails safer for everyone immediately, correction officers, inmates, or civilians. We are concerned that the entire plan to close Rikers Island and to open new jails in the community is based on the idea that the inmate population can be brought down from 9,000 daily inmates to 5,000. Contrary to what the public has been told, the majority of inmates held at Rikers are there because of serious crimes they committed, not because they are unable to make bail. Does the city really think our communities would be safer if we simply let criminals back into the streets, all because the inmate population needs to drop by almost 50%? Another issue that is problematic is the undisputed fact that while many elected officials are quick to support closing the 9 jails on Rikers Island, virtually none of them support building new jails in their districts or their communities. So it is a fair question to ask, how genuine are the elected officials who want to close Rikers, yet oppose opening new jails in their community? Another important question to consider is, how much have the communities in the boroughs been consulted on the plans to build new jails? Are the voices of the community really being heard? Later tonight, there's going to be a town hall meeting in the Bronx, attended by many residents who are angry over the fact that neither they nor their elected representatives, including the Bronx Borough President, were ever consulted about Mayor de Blasio's plan to build a new jail in Mott Haven. And finally, we're going to look at Mayor de Blasio's actual record when it comes to the reforms he put in place to address the jail violence. The mayor's own annual management report shows that inmate-on-inmate assaults and assaults on correction officers have gone up each year for the past 4 years that he's been mayor. And just in the first 6 months of the new fiscal year, assaults on correction officers have spiked 67%. So if the violence continued to rise annually, how successful have the mayor's jail reforms actually been? The entire city was shaken several weeks ago by the gang assault on correction officer Gene Chiffon, who sustained a fractured neck and bleeding on his brain, amongst other injuries. This was one of the most vicious attacks on a correction officer in recent years. Yet, Officer Chiffon is just one of 2,000 correction officers who've been assaulted by violent inmates since Mayor de Blasio took office in 2014. And in 2016, despite the warnings from former Commissioner Joseph Pont to Mayor de Blasio and the Board of Corrections not to eliminate punitive segregation for inmates 21 and under, the mayor went ahead and eliminated for the most violent population of inmates we have. So it is our hope that by exploring the real issues beyond the hype of closing Rikers, today's panel will provide the insight and perspectives that have been left out of the important debate over the future of New York City jails. We appreciate you joining us today, and we hope you will leave here with a more balanced understanding of what's at stake, who wins and who loses.
All right, welcome, Elias.
Good morning, thank you.
And this is our Q&A portion. We'll run for about half an hour or so, maybe a little longer, before we get to our full panel. Elias will also be joining us on the panel. But to start things off quickly, big picture question. Can the city close Rikers Island in 10 years, I guess 9 years now, and should it do so?
Realistically, can they close it? I'm sure they can. Should they close it? No, I don't think so.
And why?
I just got back early this morning. I went to Pennsylvania yesterday to the funeral of a Pennsylvania correction officer that was murdered by an 18-year-old inmate. Beat him to death, pretty much. And most of the places that I've been while traveling around the country, jails are not located smack dab in the middle of people's communities. They're normally located in remote areas, just like Rikers Island, which is still here in the 5 boroughs, but it's in East Elmhurst, and most people, if you drove by, wouldn't even know that 420 acres of land was there. I think that where the 9 jails on Rikers Island is right now, currently, is just fine for the purpose that it serves. So no, I don't think they need to, and I don't think that they should. I am a resident of New York. I live in Staten Island, and I am a correctional officer, and I don't want a jail next door to me. I don't want a jail across the street from me. I don't want a jail down the block from me at all. There is no real upside to the community opening a jail next door to where we live. We actually, speaking as a citizen of New York, we're actually the biggest losers when it comes to opening jails in the communities. Meaning, if my home right now is valued at $800,000, what's going to be the value of my home when you build a jail next door? And the fact of the matter is, if this was Walk Hill, New York, or some upstate community, where when you build a jail, the community actually benefit from the jail being there. No community where any jail is going to be built in the 5 boroughs is going to benefit. It's not going to create new jobs. It's not going to do anything for property value. As a matter of fact, jails are 24/7, 24 hours a day operation, meaning that all day long, correctional officers are transporting inmates back and forth. It's like living next door to a firehouse. It's like living next door to a precinct. Most people who live in these communities who have precincts, although they appreciate the protection, they hate the fact that parking is atrocious because the precincts take all the parking. They hate the fact that the firehouse, actually there's whole lines of the block where they can't park. So what do you think happens when you bring a jail to the community? The exact same thing, maybe even worse, because currently we do more than 1,600 visitors a day in the New York City jail system. So when you open up a jail next door to me, where are these visitors coming to? Where are these people traveling in and out? That's why you have the problem that you're having tonight in Mott Haven. They don't want the jail because they know what it's going to bring, and they know what it's going to be about. I just feel like if we can get the governor of this state and the mayor of this state to just be honest, if we can get all of the legislators and politicians to just be honest as to why you want to shut down the 9 jails on Rikers Island, just be honest. Don't tell us you want to shut down Rikers Island, because you don't. You want to reuse Rikers Island. If you look at the Lippman report, they have hundreds of suggestions as to what can be done with the 420 acres. But everybody said we have to shut it down because there's torture. We have to shut it down. There's a culture of violence. We have to shut it down. And all of these reasons that are being given are not the reason why these people want to shut down the 9 jails on Rikers Island. And just to back up to your question, even the jail they're talking about building in the Bronx and Mott Haven, how long is that going to take? How long is it going to take to build that jail? 3 years? 5 years? 6 years? I mean, damn, they're still working on the Trappo Bridge. They're still working on Thrive. They haven't been able, I'm 57 years old, I live in the Bronx 10 years. I left and I've been gone more than 10 years and they're still working on the bridges.
Well, let me jump in there. You mentioned the mayor and the governor, and politically at least, they are both seeming to be trying to outdo each other in how quickly they can close this down. So things would have to shift considerably, I think, for people to decide, okay, we're actually going to keep it open. But you also mentioned that I think there have been federal reports that talk about this culture of violence. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District has documented that and put out reports. So clearly there are other stated motives for closing this. But if you got your wish and Rikers Island did stay open, is there anything that should change, that should be, and that could be, and that would make that a viable path forward?
For a while, we've been avoiding this topic, this conversation of shutting down Rikers, because as correctional officers, we have a much more important issue or concern. The much more important issue or concern to us is the safety of the jails. Part of the argument of most of the shut down Rikers advocates and people is that they want to do it because it's going to somehow make the jail safer. But when I have a correctional officer in Manhattan House of Detention, the Tombs on White Street, who was cut across his neck and ended up getting 7 stitches, that didn't happen on one of the 9 jails in Rikers Island. When I have correctional officers who are receiving broken jaws in VCVC in the Bronx, or who are being dragged down the stairs and stomped and kicked in the Brooklyn House of Detention, those things didn't happen in jails on Rikers Island. So there are people out here who seem to think that by building a new jail, that all of a sudden they're going to somehow address, or that's going to reduce the violence that's going on in the jail, as opposed to really addressing the issue of what's driving the violence in the jail. I believe someone said, and I don't know who it was, said something that prisons or jails is a microcosm of the society at large. We're saying that Rikers Island, we created a culture of violence, but every day we're arresting 39 gang members for assault, for gun charges, for violence, for rape, for drug. And where are we putting them? Inside the New York City jails, right? The guy that killed the EMS worker, the one that shot the 2 police officers, the one that shot or knocked out the old lady in the Bronx and she ended up dying. Where are we putting them? We're bringing these violent people to jail, to Rikers Island, and then we're accusing the correction officer or the Department of Correction of creating a culture of violence. There's just a lot of hypocrisy that goes on. Another example, like you talked about the Department of Justice. 4 or 5 years ago, they said we had fight clubs. They said we had the program. They said that we were abusing 16 and 17-year-olds. So let's fast forward. 4 or 5 years later, they signed the raise the age legislation. Well, guess who they want to go to the Bronx, to Crossroads, and to Rise in Brooklyn to work with the 16 and 17-year-olds? The people that they say are abusing them, doing fight clubs. They're saying all of a sudden now we are the best qualified and the best equipped to work with the 16 and 17-year-old. Just the hypocrisy. We're dealing with a lot of hypocrisy. We're dealing with people who want to villainize correction officers as the reason why Rikers Island or the 9 jails on Rikers Island should be closed. That's why we continue to say, just be honest. You want the island. You're the governor. You lease it to the city. If you want it back, say you want it back, but don't demonize or villainize correction officers as the reason why you have to get it. We see violence every day in the streets of New York City. More than 5,000 New Yorkers have been slashed or stabbed, getting off the bus, getting off the train, going home, coming out of the supermarket, coming out of their homes. That's not Rikers Island. Don't get me wrong, we have those situations and those isolated incidents, I say isolated, where correction officers overstep their bound. We have that, those happen. And each time they happen, they are charged. Some end up doing time. So it's not like those things are not being answered or addressed. That's not the issue for us. So where you put a jail, for the most part, if the jails are not safe today, what are you telling me that by building new jails, they're gonna be safe when you build a new one? Look, not too long ago, or a while back, there was a city councilman, his name was James Davis. Someone came into City Hall, pulled out a gun, and shot James Davis dead. Did it take the city council a long time to decide that everybody from this point forward that come into City Hall is going to go through a metal detector? Did it take them a long time to make that decision? No. Did it take them a long time? Were they concerned about the brain development or the mental health of the gentleman who shot James Davis? No. But now it comes to New York City correction officers, and now we have to sit with legislators, the governor, the mayor, the city council, the assembly, the senate, and have people tell us about the brain development of the 4 18-year-olds that stomped John Safran. And he's still in the hospital today. He still haven't walked. But we have a mayor who says that is cruel, that is inhumane, that is not the right thing, but none of them, none, not even some who are going to be on this panel, will attempt to tell correction officers what we should do with these 4 18-year-olds. They will only tell us what we can't do with them. And we say a crime is a crime regardless of where it's committed, whether it's in jail or on the streets of New York.
Well, to build on that, regardless, it will take a matter of years to close Rikers Island, whether it's 3 years, whether it's 9 years, whether it stays open indefinitely. Are there areas of agreement where you and then the de Blasio administration and the Cuomo administration can say, you know, in this interim period, these are the things we all agree we need to do to make it safer for correction officers, for inmates?
I think the New York City Correction Officers Benevolent Association, COBA, we have been discussing this before Bill de Blasio took his position. We can go back 5 years, 10 years of saying to the mayor and saying to City Hall that we need safer jails, and we need safer jails today. See, how is there a discussion about building new jails if there is no discussion on how to create safer jails? How do we have this discussion? And we can't have the mayor or anyone say that, listen, we put $4.1 million to improve safety. Stun guns don't stop inmates from assaulting correction officers or other inmates. $4.1 million to buy 100 new stun guns or to beef up an outside patrol does nothing to create safety inside the jails. So we have these people with these Jedi mind tricks that try to confuse the public and say we are doing something to make the jail safer when you're absolutely doing nothing. The hypocrisy is that you can take an 18-year-old inmate and you can send that inmate to Suffolk County or Nassau County or Rockland County where they have punitive segregation, where some of them actually have solitary confinement. You can send them there and you can have it done to them there, but you can't do it here. You can't address what we should do with the less than 100 inmates that's responsible for the bulk or the majority of the violence that's going on inside the New York City jail. So to answer your question, we've been fighting like hell to get the mayor to understand. We fought like hell to get him not to eliminate punitive segregation. I mean, I say it often, a mayor as liberal as Mike Bloomberg didn't touch punitive segregation, which is why under his administration, the violence was kept down at a minimum because he understood. But now we get this mayor who take advice from former inmates. These are the people who are advising him on how to run a New York City jail system more than he does. If you looked at his last press conference, who did he bring up to talk about the jails? He didn't bring up Commissioner Brand. He didn't bring up Chief Hazel Jennings to talk about the jails, to talk about safer jails. He brought up Stanley Richards. Who's Stanley Richards? Board of Correction guy. Has he ever run a jail? Hell no. So why is he out front? Why is he the one dictating to how or what should be done inside a jail, along with the other 8 members of the Board of Corrections who have no knowledge of how to run a jail?
Sure, so punitive segregation seems like that'd be at the top of your wish list. But to be fair, the governor is pursuing various reforms in Albany, trying to reduce the population of inmates, bail reform, speedier trials, diversions beforehand, which gets to this broader goal, get it down from 9,000 to 5,000. Is that fundamental goal something you think is a good idea, something you could get behind?
Again, let's look at some numbers. 2017, 55,000 New Yorkers was arrested and turned over to the New York City Department of Correction, 55,000, right? Out of the 55,000, 41,000 of them had been in jail last year from 2 to 9 times. So what are we doing? What are we freaking talking about? Taking down the average daily population when you have, the year before that it was 47,000 who've been in jail 2 to 9 times. So you have a mayor and a governor and legislators who are, again, being hypocritical. Because if you really want to reduce the population in jail, when are you going to address the 47,000 who don't seem to be able to stay out of jail? And the other thing is everything that these people do, from the governor, from the mayor, from the city council, everything that they do is after someone's locked up, is after they're in jail. You want to provide them new housing. You want to build a new jail where they're going to have a 10 by 15 cell with a sink and a stove and a refrigerator and doors that lock. But before they go to jail, they're in what? They're where? 60,000 of them are homeless. I don't even know the number of them who suffer from mental illness. So we're doing everything. Look, the New York Corrections is the last stop on the train. So if the mayor, the governor, and everybody wants to be genuinely honest, then deal with these people before they come to jail. Don't wait till they come to jail to decide that you want to teach them how to be a food handler. Don't wait till they get in jail. You want to give them a program to teach them how to be a carpenter, to teach them how to drive. Why aren't you doing this in the community now? It's just, to me, look, shutting down Rikers is what someone said years ago. It's about the landlord against the landless. They want the land. Just be honest. You want the land. You don't want to shut down Rikers. You want to reuse Rikers. Last night, I drove by LaGuardia. I've been driving by LaGuardia for 30 years. I have never seen the type of construction and expansion that's going on at LaGuardia. LaGuardia is reminding me now of the old Western movie where they were building the railroad, and there was one house in the middle. One house in the middle. You know what's in the middle of stopping LaGuardia from being an international airport? The 420 acres that's called Rikers Island. My thing is, you want it, take it. But don't use us as the scapegoat as to why you want to shut the jails down. If you look at all of the people who are calling for putting jails in the Black and Latino community, because according to Judge Lippman's report, they want to put the jails in the Black and Latino community because according to them, this is where the majority of the inmates come from. Well, let me ask you a question. When you look at the people who are calling for opening the jails in the Black and Latino community, are they Black and Latino? Because when I go to these meetings, they don't look like it. I don't see the community. You're going to see the community tonight. The people you see tonight in Mott Haven, they're the ones who are the Black and Latino community. And they're saying what? We don't want this jail.
And in your video address, you also talked about inmate assaults and inmate assaults on correction officers, and you haven't seen a real improvement there under de Blasio. And you mentioned some specific incidents. Though under the leadership of Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark, has she not been more aggressive in responding to attacks on correction officers? And have you seen any improvement from those efforts?
See, again, first of all, I mean, the relationship of law enforcement unions with district attorneys is sometimes really rocky, but I'm going to say this. District Attorney Clark has been doing her job, and she's doing a great job of remanding inmates who assault correction officers, who assault civilians. She is definitely remanding them. She's giving them increased bails. She's been able to convince her judges to give them consecutive sentences. But that's not, this is not a one-pronged problem. The third thing is, even with the Department of Corrections, they have actually been rearresting inmates more than they ever have before. But this is where our problem come in. And this is what the mayor doesn't get, and this is what most legislators don't get. It takes more than just a rearrest and an additional remand or an additional bail or consecutive sentences to stop the violence that goes on inside the jails. The problem is the 4 inmates who did this to Officer Safan. If they didn't send them upstate and we brought them back to Rikers, you know what would have happened to them? Nothing. There would have been no disciplinary sanctions because they're under the age of 21. So we couldn't put them in punitive segregation. We can't give them non-contact visits. We can't restrict their commissary. We can't restrict them going out for recreation. Nothing, because of what the mayor and the city council did when they eliminated punitive seg. And they not only eliminated punitive seg, but they actually watered down or eliminated the other disciplinary sanction that we used to use in order to try to keep the violence down. Look, reality is jail, and jail is always going to have violence, always. We're never going to stop the violence in jail. Anybody who thinks that is out of their mind. Look at the people who are being put in our custody. Look at the people who the NYPD are arresting and sending to us. But we have always been able to control the violence. For everything that this mayor and former City Council Speaker Melissa Viverito did to disarm us, to put our lives and the lives of inmates in further danger, is the reason why they can't bring the numbers down. I talk about the fact that more than 2,000 correction officers have been assaulted since de Blasio's been mayor. But I have to also say that more than 700 inmates have been stabbed, slashed, or cut by other inmates, which you never hear the advocacy groups talk about. You never hear them talk about inmate on inmate violence. They will pick out the incidents of an assault of a correction officer, but they never talk about the people who they really should be, because the last inmate who got seriously cut by another inmate after 200 stitches, the doctors stop counting. But we don't hear anything about that from these people or from the people who've been having these type of pains. They're only concerned about the ones who are doing the cutting. They're not concerned about the ones who are being cut. They're not concerned about correction officers are the good guys. And like Senator Flanagan said, if you're gonna choose between the bad guy and the good guy, you should always choose the good guy. And the things that we won't allow to happen to New York City police officers or even an EMS worker, we should never allow to happen to New York City correction officers. So whatever they're saying about closing the alley, look, who are the winners? Who are the biggest winners? If they do what Judge Lippman's report said, if they extend LaGuardia's runway, if they put an additional terminal, what did he say in his report? That would generate an additional $17 billion a year for the state of New York. That's a big ass winner. They said that it would allow LaGuardia to bring in an additional 12 million people a year, an additional 12 million to New York. That's a win. A win for who? It's not a win for the Black and Latino communities where you want to put the jails. It's not a win for those people in the community who own their homes and work and bust their behind. It's not a win for those who don't want to come out of their homes and take their son and daughter and say, yeah, that's a jail across the street over there. I got to pass the jail to get to school. It's a win for who? And don't get me wrong, nobody's against improvement. Nobody is against creating jobs. We're not. But what we're against is the hypocrisy that we see coming from the inmate advocates, from the governor himself, from the mayor himself, from city council members, from the assemblies who say shut it down. Even Ruben Diaz Jr., the Bronx District Attorney, just said, we have to shut Rikers Island down. And I'm waiting to see Ruben, because I want Ruben to tell me why we have to shut Rikers Island down. And I want to know from him. And he don't even want the jail that they're building in Mott Haven. He says we have to shut it down, but he don't want a jail in the Bronx. This is the hypocrisy that we have to deal with. And that's what it is. And I'm not being disrespectful. I'm just saying, I'm just calling people out. I'm just saying, be for real. Be for real, and don't use my correctional, don't use my members as the scapegoat for why you have to do something.
But again, with the violence that we've seen documented at Rikers, the state had a commission that recently came out with a report that I think seemed to back up some of what the Department of Justice had found, that yes, there's violence, but there's more violence. The Rikers is one of the worst actors in the state. And so again, I would ask, other than your proposal of bringing back punitive segregation, if you were to keep Rikers open, how do you change this, what people say is a culture of violence? If it's not that, are there structural changes that can be made? What, if anything, specifically should be done?
Someone once said that when a landlord wants you out, what does he do? He won't give you heat. He won't do anything to stop the rats and the roaches. He won't collect the garbage. He won't make simple repairs. Rikers Island is that place, and the city of New York is that landlord. They've neglected the facilities in the jails on Rikers Island, and I believe it was intentional. Listen, I don't want you or anyone in this room to attempt to make it appear that the only thing that correction officers is concerned about is punitive segregation, because nothing can be farther from the truth. We have all types of things that we do for inmates in the system when they're in our custody. Inmates look forward to correction officers coming to work. We're their only access to the outside. A lot of them, even after they get out, try to keep in contact with us, because the majority of my members do exactly what they're supposed to do. We are the good guys. We take care of these inmates. We make sure they go to school. We just had an inmate not too long ago, 18 years old, that got a scholarship. Most people don't know he got a scholarship while he was in jail, while there was correction officers making sure that he went to school. He got the scholarship under our custody. Do you understand the type of things that we do to promote and to help inmates through the programs that we have? So I don't want anybody sitting here thinking that we're just concerned about punitive sex. No, we're more than punitive sex. And we're not just concerned about punitive sex, but we have to understand that the #1 priority of a jail system is to be safe. And if you can't make the inmates safe, then they're forced to join gangs. If you can't make them safe, then they're forced to try to protect themselves. So for anybody to try to water down or make punitive segregation seem insignificant, shame on you. Shame on you. One of the things I'll say, I'm 57 years old, and my little knowledge of the civil rights movement, I feel like correction officers are here, and we're performing a function and a duty, and we're taking care of the city, and we're keeping the city safe. And the state and the city, who's responsible to keep us safe, isn't doing it. And during the civil rights, there was this argument about whether the state or whether the feds. At this point, correction officers are not supposed to have to beg the governor for us to be safe. We're not supposed to have to beg the city mayor to be safe. We're not supposed to have to beg the speaker of the city council to put in laws that make it safe for us. We're not supposed to have to beg the assembly to give us a scanner that help us detect weapons. We're not supposed to have to beg to do our job. We're not supposed to have to beg any. Nobody begs us. Every day we get up and we don our uniform and we keep these jails safe. The only thing people talk about is the 9,000, 10,000. We handled more than 65,000 inmates last year. Our use of force level is low, and what I consider low because of what we do and because of our professionalism. And like I said, I'm not going to allow anyone to take isolated incidents where correction officers are involved and make it seem like it's the work. For instance, police officers have done all kinds of crazy things. But every time you talk to the union or to the NYPD, do you ask them, what about the police officer that did this? The city council itself, how many of their members have been arrested and indicted for bribery, for taking money that they wasn't supposed to take? But every time you talk to the city council, do you say, hey, what about that city councilman? Hey, what about that? Do you say that those are isolated incidents? Yeah, that's what they are. That's what they are. So I'm not going to allow anybody, when they keep talking to me, asking me about isolated incidents that happen inside the jails with officers who go too far. My position and the union position on officers who disgrace the shield is very clear and very simple. We don't need them. We don't want them. We don't want them to be a part of our union. We don't want them to be a part of our organization. I'm not going to keep answering that. So at the end of the day, this island of torture, I mean, I go to meetings and I hear people say, oh, I was in the cell and I was peeping through the crack. Because every cell on Rikers Island have a window. Every cell on Rikers Island, every door has a window. You don't have to peep through a crack. So I have to sometimes sit through these dramatizations and untruth and things that's not real and see people try to villainize us. Look, I'm told 62% of the contributions to most of the legislators in this city come from real estate developments. And I tell you, Rikers Island is a hell of a piece of real estate.
Well, Elias, you've raised a lot of good points. Let's give him a hand on this portion. And I'd like to bring our panel to the stage at this point. We'll jump right into our full panel discussion. I'm sure we'll have some responses, some further thoughts on some of the points that we've raised so far. Again, if you could all make your way to the stage.
Where am I?
Here.
No, I think they told me to move.
Sorry.
He wants me to move over, right? There you go. I guess that makes sense. You good? Yeah.
Good.
All right. As you can see, we have a full panel discussion, a full panel here, 8 members, and a lot of ground to cover. We have about 1 hour. So I'll jump right in, briefly introduce everyone. We have Elizabeth Glazer, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice, Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams, New York City Council members Keith Powers, Giovanni Williams, Robert Holden, and Joseph Borelli, as well as James Quinn, Senior Executive Assistant District Attorney in the Queens DA's office, and Elias Hussamadeen, who we just heard from. And so, to kick it off, I'd like to ask the panel as a whole, again, the first question that I asked Elias, can the city close Rikers in 9 years? Should it do so, and why? And we'll start at the far end.
Great. The answer is yes. The answer is it's a steep hill, and I think Elias raised a number of the reasons why. We think it's the right thing to do, which is the reason why we want to do it. We think that jails work better when they're in neighborhoods, when people who are incarcerated are closer to families and lawyers. We've seen that jails actually have become civic assets in our city. We see what's happened, for example, in downtown Brooklyn around that jail. And we think it's possible. The first thing we have to do is get the population down. That is critical. New York City already has the lowest incarceration rate of any city in the nation, almost half of what Chicago and LA has. The population has changed quite a bit in the past 2 decades, and the folks who are in there are charged with felonies, about 97% of them, about half of those with violent felonies. And so getting the population down further is definitely an important thing and a hard thing. We've gotten the population down about 20% in the last 4 years, even as crime's gone down. To get it down further will mean we have to shorten the amount of time that people stay there, which means that the courts and DAs and defenders have to kick in a very major way to deliver justice in a speedy way. We definitely, as Elias very eloquently sort of outlined, need to change the culture inside. We need to make things better for both officers and staff who work there and for people who are incarcerated because it's the right thing to do and also because we are going to be on Rikers Island for a while we build. And finally, and a number of council people are here who obviously play an important part in that, we need to be able to build the kinds of facilities that are actually going to produce a smaller, safer, and fairer justice system. And that means places that are not as dilapidated as Rikers, but more affirmatively, places that have light and air and encourage and have space for the kinds of activities that both produce productive lives and reduce violence.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Borough President?
Just immediately, yes, but it has to be done right. But I also want to deal with some underlining parts here, because I may not get the mic again because this is a long list of folks. I want to thank Elias, and I know what some of you were saying as Elias was speaking. Hey, look at this angry black man, and if he's not angry, he's not human. And the comments he made, even to say, I don't want members who tarnish the shield to be part of our industry. Never has any law enforcement union president ever said that. Never. Never. They embrace them, they hide them, they protect them. He has made it clear. When you look at what is happening in Rikers and to members of the Department of Correction, is a well-known secret, overwhelmingly a union of color. The inmates are of color. There's been a mindset in the law enforcement community for years, let the savages kill each other. They have not received the right amount of tools that they need. Push them off to Rikers Island, we don't see them again, so what? Let's act like they're not even here. DOC members have been stating for years, there's a problem here. Too many gangs, too much violence, not enough recreation, having inmates sit around, fight each other. No one has listened to them. And Elias has been doing an unbelievable job of pointing out, we will never allow police officers to be under the condition that members of the Department of Correction are under. Never. You would never allow a police officer to be ambushed. Never. This entire city would change rules and policies to prevent it from happening. But you're allowing a predominant Black and Hispanic union and membership to go through this. Oh, Eric, stop playing the race card. Well, that's the only goddamn card in the deck. And this, what is happening to these officers for years, I saw it for 22 years as a police officer, what has happened to members of the Department of Correction. And every young person that is in the Department of Correction are not there merely because they did not get enough hugs from their mother. Some of them are violent. Some of them have committed violent acts. And the culture of violence, if you do it incorrectly of closing Rikers, you're gonna take that culture and you're gonna move it to the borough jails that you're moving it through. You have to deal with the underlying issue of what has happened in Rikers Island, not dealing with some of the real issues that are happening to young people when they get there and before they get there. And that is important. We can't sugarcoat this. It's not about just closing a piece of real estate and moving into another piece of real estate. It's about dealing with the real issues of violence on Rikers and what are the conditions that causes the violence. Like 50% of the children who are on Rikers Island, I learned a couple of years ago, are dyslexic. Think about that number, 50% of them are dyslexic. So if you didn't get the care you needed in the early diagnosis when you were in school of dyslexia, you start going on the corner slinging drugs, you start carrying a gun, you start using the gun, then you end up in Rikers only because you didn't get the services you needed because people didn't understand why you couldn't read and write. So, yes, we can close Rikers, but we need to listen to those members of the Department of Correction who are on the ground to talk about how do we do it in an effective manner that we're not going to harm correction officers, we're not going to harm innocent civilians, and guess what? We're not going to harm the inmates themselves. If it's not done correctly, we're going to move the culture of violence from the island to the boroughs and the communities. I'm in favor of the closure, but it must be done correctly.
Thank you, Borough President. Councilman Powers, who I should note is the new chair of the Correction Committee in the Council.
Criminal Justice, but we oversee the Corrections Committee. And that's a good segue just to note that we have a number of folks who are from the Department of Corrections, Rikers Commission. We do have Stanley Richards here as well, who I think is a fantastic appointee, and I think that somebody who actually has real life experience, whether it's, it may not be working in the jail, but I think is actually an important voice in that conversation. And then members from the people from the Department of Probation and folks from City Council as well. So thank you for putting this on. We took a tour of Rikers Island last week, and I was happy that both Stanley and Elias joined us because I thought we had a very productive conversation about the safety of both the people that are residing on Rikers Island and the people that are working there. And I thought that in addition to the regular tour we would have gotten, to have those two be able to add their voices, and I think Councilmember Holton would agree, was actually a really important conversation. And I note that Stanley Richards and I just, I think 2 days ago, had a follow-up conversation about that exact discussion around safety and ways that the City Council and the Board of Corrections can ensure the safety of the people that are working there, and to ensure that as either the transition happens to close Rikers Island, but also in the 10 years or 5 years or whatever the number we're using now is, that it's fixed immediately. And so I don't think that the voices aren't being heard. And in fact, I think it was a productive conversation that has some ways to go. Look, I think we are on a path to close Rikers Island. I don't think the reality versus dream versus reality conversation is really one we're having anymore. I think that we have committed to a timeline and a process. Elias is correct, though. There are still hurdles in that process. Even tonight, there's conversations in the Bronx about the facility that is due to be located there. And so saying that we have a process does not mean we have new buildings built. We still have a long way to go to actually get the facilities built. But I think we are, to ask for the timeline, I think the timeline that we're talking about right now, and I think the Littman Commission talked about the other day as well, is if we get certain procurement design build rules, it could be as fast as 6.5 years, 7 years, and it could be 9 or so if we don't get those rules. And it's important to me that we are able to do those faster to commit ourselves to the process. The one thing I want to contest that was said earlier is that the corrections is the last place for people. It's not. It's the streets of New York City are the last place that anybody who's there, it comes back. That is why we have to have a commitment, both to the safety of everybody in the jail, but also that's when we talk about safety and security, it's recognizing that the last stop isn't the jail or isn't prison, that many of these people are going to be back in our community and are members of our community, and that we have a right and a responsibility to keep them safe and to ensure that when they come back out, that we have appropriate services for them, we can help them find a job, we can help them find housing, but also that when they're residing on Rikers Island, that we are viewing them as members of the community and members of our community again in the future. So I just want to contest that because I think that's actually an inappropriate view, although I understand where it came from, but I think it's the view that we should all have is that we are living amongst, we are walking amongst, we are here amongst people that are going to spend time at Rikers Island. I know people who spend time at Rikers Island. They're my friends. And so the idea that we're treating them as that's the last stop, I think it's actually an incorrect view, and that's why I view this as a responsibility that we have as a city and as a city council and as legislators.
Thank you. Councilman Williams?
Thank you. I'm going to try to get some into it. I do think eight people is a lot. But I just wanted to acknowledge that this is the most disciplined, quietest protest I've seen in a long time. So that's awesome. But I do want to highlight one thing. Where are the voices of the formerly incarcerated? Because very often we have these discussions and don't include the people who are closest to the problem and may have a good voice of how to get a solution. So I just want to highlight that because I think it's very important. We tend to do it a lot. I also try to start from a bird's eye. And so the bird's eye, I always say, to me, the system is not broken. It's working how it was designed to operate from the beginning of this country. And so people who are in certain places have certain privileges and people who don't. This is how the country was designed on purpose. And so for me, it's never about fixing a broken system. It's about changing the system entirely. And because if you have a house that has a small crack, it's easy to kind of fix that. If the foundation of the house is jacked up, you have a harder thing to do. And we should be talking about fixing changing the foundation so that it's better. And just so folks realize in the country, we represent about 4% of the population. We have 25% of the world's prison population. So every fourth person that is in prison in this world is in the United States of America, although we only represent 4%. I think 80% of the people in Rikers are black and brown. I don't think that's not by accident. I don't think anybody who studies this stuff believes it's by accident. That is important because I believe if the population looked different, the discussions would be different much, much earlier. And so if the population reversed, it was 80% white children that were there, we would immediately understand what needs to be done. We would immediately understand the inhumane conditions. I believe as was pointed out, if the union was 80% white, there would be different discussions of how to do it. I believe their voices have not been at the table in a meaningful way, and I hope the administration will allow that to happen because I think their voices are important as well. Violence is violence, and I want to make sure it stops all over. But the way we have the system now, it is designed, I believe, for this type of violence. It's not designed for corrections. It's designed to house people. We have to remember that most of the people there are innocent. At least that's what we say. We probably would say more often if the complexion of them looked differently. But the majority of people there have not been proven guilty of anything, and we call them inmates, we call them whatever, and we push them to the side. It's important to say that. And if you don't believe me, we can look at the way things happen. The same thing. So we look at what's happening with the opioid crisis now, the heroin crisis. how people are being viewed. It's amazing they're being viewed as human beings. Can you imagine that? People who are addicted to drugs being treated as human beings who need assistance. And we look at what's happening with marijuana, and we look at what's happening with the crack cocaine in the same community. Even as we're legalizing marijuana, we still have not looking at people who are in jail for selling the same product. Even as we're legalizing marijuana, we are saying people who have criminal records cannot access that pipeline to sell. We can look at the same drug, heroin, in the 60s and 70s, when the complexion was different then. How are those people treated? So it's not hyperbole to say people are treated differently depending on the amount of melanin in their skin. Also, generally speaking, we want to keep the system going because we are trained to believe that the answer to public safety is locking up as many black and brown people as humanly possible. We also show from the data that that does not work. And so many of the work I and others did many years ago around criminal justice issues, stop, question, frisk, gun violence, we were told by many of the same people who tell us now that we are not looking at this properly, that the sky would literally crack open, black and brown people will fall from it, start killing each other, and destroy the entire city. They couldn't have been more wrong. And so as of last year, the city the safest it's been since 1951. And I thank a lot of people for that, including the NYPD who have been charged of law enforcement, not necessarily to be equated to public safety. That's a broader discussion. And I say that to say, people have never been right about this who says we're wrong in trying to do this more humanely. Never. Normally people don't get less safe, we get more safe. And we have to look at this thing as a whole. And so when you have Rikers Island named after a slave catcher pushed to the side, that is a problem that we have to look at. And I agree the culture of violence has to be looked at and how we do it better. But we should be all starting from the same framework of reference of what's happening and why. There's always people saying, no, don't do any reforms. These are people, leave them to their own devices. They're always saying that, and they are always wrong. And unfortunately, whether it is consciously, subconsciously, specifically, or just in the system, that is usually based on who we're talking about and what they look like. But to the answer of your question, I think I wanted to see closed in 9 years. I would actually like to see it closed faster, and so I would like a faster timeline. Part of that is because I just want to see it happen. Another part is government historically doesn't hit timelines. So if you aim for 9, I don't know what it's really going to be, and so why not aim for 5 and see what we can do.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Holden?
I want to thank you for this. We need more debate on this, and it has to go on. Coming into the city council, this seemed like a done deal to close Rikers, which I couldn't understand. Visiting Rikers, I got a very different view than my colleague Powers, Councilman Powers. I thought it was pretty interesting. The security, just to go through, to get on the island is kind of difficult. To get off, we had a problem getting off the island. You had to go through a bunch of checkpoints, so you have to turn over your ID. And the problem that I see here is security, at least in the community jails. If you're going to propose community jails, unless you're putting a moat with alligators around the structure, there's going to be a problem. For instance, a gentleman got out last year of, I think, a jail. He couldn't get off the island. I mean, look at the island. Look at what's surrounding it. To me, this seems like a land grab, and there's a number of issues, obviously, but then look at the price tag on this thing. I think it's between 10 and 11 billion to build community jails and to close Rikers. Even though I heard that the city's going to invest $1 billion into Rikers before they close it, which is a mistake. Don't know if that's totally true. The city has a lot of building to do, by the way. How about our transit system, for instance? How much of investment there? We have to put big money into our transit system, yet where we want to actually build community jails, which would be less secure than Rikers. Rikers is the most secure jail that I've seen. Well, also, look at the incarceration rate. We're by far the lowest of any big city in the United States. I think it's now down to 165. Compare that with cities like Philadelphia, which I think is something, we're in the 800 per 100,000. So to cut that in half, I think is irresponsible. For instance, getting down, where does 5,000 come from? The mayor has all these lofty goals, but where'd that come from, 5,000? Did he talk to the DAs? I know the Queens DA, and James Quinn, by the way, Assistant DA, laid out very good, I think he might even have some posters and some facts and figures that he's going to talk about, which I've been to the debate where he was featured, and Elias is providing tremendous leadership. But we need to actually look at, and the Lippman Commission didn't look at this, rebuilding Rikers, modernize it. You can make it bright and airy. You can have these wonderful programs there. So why do we have to replicate? And by the way, there are wonderful programs. 16 and 17-year-olds are getting an education, mandatory. If they're incarcerated there for any length of time, they go to classes. Wonderful, mandatory. The problem is the 18 to 21-year-olds don't have to. And as we saw on our tour, only about 10% of the 18 to 21-year-olds take advantage of that. I think that should be mandatory for 18 to 21s, because 40% of them come back to Rikers. So that's the thing. Education is very, very important. Rather than idle time sitting around in a jail, you can educate them. So offer those programs. And there's many other things you can do with Rikers, but certainly rebuilding has to be an option, which I have. Rebuilding Rikers, modernize it, has to be an option. And why it hasn't been discussed even, I don't. It's bewildering. But I think at this point, and I think I speak for my constituents, is that we don't want a jail and everything that comes with it. We don't want correction vehicles all over the place, police, lawyers. If you look at, and the proposal is the Queens House of Detention to house them. 450, by the way, can fit there now. 450 prisoners. A far cry. If you look at the total number right now, 9,000, you're just picking a goal to cut down the population. But it's just, I don't see that it can work. So I don't want, right now, the courts, around the courts, I think in every borough, very congested. You're going to add jails, and you're going to add lawyers, cars. You're going to add correction vehicles. You're going to add people visiting. I think that is a huge problem, certainly for the neighborhoods. So of course, they can close Rikers. I just don't see that's a great option, and I think it's a tremendous waste of resources. Certainly, it's a tremendous waste of money. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Borelli?
Thank you, John. Thank you. Good morning. Thanks, City and State. And I want to echo what Bob Holden said. I, too, do not want to see any lawyers' vehicles in my district whatsoever. That's the last thing we need. Time of breakfast? So I'm not here today to necessarily tell you that I'm opposed to the closing of Rikers Island. I think any concerns that I have are more about the future safety of officers and inmates. And to piggyback on something that Jumani had said, and he's someone that I respect, and we're friends, and we agree and disagree, the thing that was predicted was that after the reform of punitive segregation for the younger inmates, the incidence of violence would rise. And that has happened. I mean, that is something that we statistically track, and we can see that has been the result. I'm not sure from a correction officer or an inmate standpoint, especially when many of the advocates have been making the case that people tend to get caught up in the system on Rikers Island, they get involved in the culture essentially leads them to extend their stays. Why you would want the 1 to 2 to 3% of the population to not be segregated, to not be punished when these type of incidents occur. To hear Elias talk, and we had that conversation earlier, that even now these inmates can't be denied commissary. Can we all perhaps agree that if you slash a correction officer or you slash a fellow inmate, maybe you don't get beef jerky that week? Like, is that too much to ask, that maybe some of your rights get rolled back a little bit? Thank you, I appreciate that. But to answer your original question, should it? Yeah, maybe. I think there is the need for reform. I think the right way was to start by rebuilding jails, modern jails that limit the interaction between COs and inmates in moments where there could be danger. I think that's certainly something that should happen. There's money in the budget for that already. That's sort of been held up because of this debate. But your original question was 9 years. So on March 8th, 2027, if anyone wants to take this action, they're welcome to. I would bet my entire house and life savings that the keys to Rikers Island are not handed over to the Port Authority or to some real estate developer, whoever it is. The city of New York can't build a baseball field in 9 years, right? There's a baseball field in my district. If I ask Bob, if I ask Keith or Giovanni, there are examples of, the Parks Department or anyone not being able to build the most simple things that we could possibly provide as a city in our district. So now you're adding the ULERT process. You're adding a very vocal debate over the siting of these jails. It takes on average for Parks Department 5 to 6 years from whence OMB authorizes the money to be spent for the actual playground or whatever it is to be built. We're not even near that point yet. And that brings us to a second point. Now there hasn't been an updated estimate since the mayor announced the 4 locations of the jails, and I imagine the number may come down as we may be using some existing facilities. But let's just go on that $10.5 billion example. Where does the city get that? And I'm not saying that flippantly. Right now, we authorize $8 billion a year, $9 billion a year in capital spending. We issue debt, we build capital projects. Where does that how can we double that? Will we be able to even float bonds to issue debt to actually build this thing? Obviously, it probably can't be done in 1 year. To give you a comparison, the state of New Jersey, the entire state of New Jersey, I just looked it up before I came, is spending $1.6 billion a year in their entire state capital plan. Right? And that includes their Department of Corrections. The number is a problem in and of itself. And whether it can be done in 1 year, I think, is impossible. I think the financing would have to be done over multiple years. And then therein refers back to my first point, that there's no way, it's delusional to even try to be planning that this facility would be closed by 2027. I think if we're operating under that assumption, we're making some mistakes, and that should be the starting point of the conversation as to what is a realistic goal of shutting down Rikers Island. And, it's taking a half hour for one question, so I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Councilman. Appreciate it. Elias, anything to add? We already got this question. No. Okay. We'll go right on to James Quinn.
Quite frankly, I don't know where to start. There are a lot of myths about Rikers Island and the closing of Rikers Island. The short answer to your question, should it be closed? I don't know. Can it be closed? Not under any present proposal. And can it be closed safely? No. That's the short answer. Right now, there are about 9,000 people on Rikers Island. The city and the Lippman Commission recommended that number be reduced to 5,000 in order to close Rikers Island, which means you have to reduce the population by 4,000 inmates within the next 10 years. But when you look at the inmates who are in Rikers Island, there are a lot of myths about them. The myths started out that there were all these fare beaters in Rikers Island. There's not a single fare beater from Queens held on Rikers Island solely for fare beating. What they're held on is the gun that was found on them when they were arrested for fare beating. That's what they're being held on. There was a big article in the New York Daily News when this first started that there were so many prostitutes in Rikers Island. We did a search. There's not a single person being held solely on prostitution from Queens on Rikers Island. We then started to look at all the defendants who are actually in Rikers Island. And if I can use my charts.
You didn't say we could bring
got
visual
charts,
aids.
man.
Come on. I mean, you didn't. This is.
In fact, I said we couldn't do a presentation. Go ahead.
This is the Rikers Island inmate population as of January 25th of 2018.
Microphone.
This is the population of Rikers as of January 25th of 2018. There were 9,010 inmates on January 25th. Now everybody says that all these people are being held on awaiting trial. Well, that's not quite true. 2,000 of them are sentenced prisoners, which brings the number down to 7,000 people who are being held awaiting trial. Of those 7,000 people being held awaiting trial, there are only 3,330 of them who are being held solely because they can't make bail. All the others are being held on violations of parole, violations of probation. They're remanded because they violated an order of protection. They're being remanded because of things that they've done while they were out. They were out on a robbery bail, and they got arrested for another robbery, and the judge remanded them. So you wind up only 48% of the pre-trial detainees, the people awaiting trial, are bailable. That's 3,300. In order to reduce the population by 4,000, you have to release every single one of these 3,330 people have to leave Rikers. And then you have to find 700 more of the people who can't be released because they've got all these holds on them. So what we did, we looked at the people who comprise the bailable defendants who are held on Rikers.
Oh, you got more.
I got loads. We looked at the people from Queens who are held on bail. Now these are the people who, if they made bail, would get out. All right? The only thing holding them is bail. We looked at the A felonies. You know, there's a myth that there are all these people being held on nonviolent felonies and for misdemeanors, being held just because they can't make $500 bail. You know how many people are being held on Rikers Island? Rikers Island has 9,000 defendants. 1,800 of them are from Queens. Do you know how many of those people, don't look at the chart yet, do you know how many of those people are being held simply because they can't make bail? Being held on an A misdemeanor? 43. All right? That's another myth about Rikers Island, that there are all these people being held in these minor charges. So then we started looking at the people who are held in the nonviolent Ds and Es. These are the car thefts. They're the people who stealing checks and employee theft and minor grand larcenies, things like that. The nonviolent defendants who are being held. For D felonies, there are 112. You know what their records look like? They have an average of 6.6 prior felony arrests, 1.5 felony convictions, 7 misdemeanor arrests, 8 misdemeanor convictions, and 3 prior failures to appear in court. Those are the nonviolent defendants who have to be released. Every one of these people has to be released in order to reduce the population on Rikers. You look at the nonviolent E felonies, there are only 39 of them who are being held solely because they can't make bail. They have an average of almost 7 prior felony arrests, 1.5 felony convictions, almost 9 prior misdemeanor arrests, almost 10 prior misdemeanor convictions, and almost 3 prior felonies to appear.
Those are averages?
These are averages. These are the people who have to be released in order to get the population down to 5,000. The concept that you can do that safely is, it's almost ludicrous to think that you can do that and release these people and not have an impact on the public safety of the people of the city of New York. We looked at, you know, there was some talk about how...
If we could streamline it, just,
All right.
we're still on question 1.
If anybody wants any of these, just email me at jcquinn@queensda.org and I'll send them all to you. But the notion that it's going to cost $10.7 billion to rebuild Rikers, well, actually, the Lippman Commission said that that's the amount of money that it would cost, but they would finance it over 30 years, and it would actually wind up costing $23 billion when you add in the interest and the financing charges, which comes out to $770 million a year, which comes out to $150,000 for each one of the 5,000 inmates on Rikers. So you're increasing the cost from $240,000 a year, which is what Lippman said it would cost now. You're increasing the cost for maintaining the inmates to almost $400,000 a year. Why Rikers has to be closed and demolished and not reformed and repaired, I don't know. It could be done a lot cheaper, a lot faster, with a lot less political capital having to be spent, and a lot safer for the people of the city of New York. I don't understand it. I think the debate has gotten mired in things that have nothing to do with the actual closing of Rikers and the processing of the prisoners in the system.
Thank you, James. And we have about 20 minutes left. I would like to get to audience questions, so I'm going to have to be a little bit selective with who gets to respond. First, I'd like to hear from Elizabeth on the city's perspective, then I think Elias will have a word as well.
So I'm going to be quick and just address one thing, because I know people are going to address others. I think it's a mistake and not right to say that the way in which we're going to reduce the population is by releasing lots and lots of dangerous people. That's a scare tactic. I completely agree with Jim that and with Elias, that the population inside looks very different than it did 20 years ago. There aren't low-level drug folks in there. There aren't turnstile jumpers. There aren't prostitutes, etc. It is more serious crimes. But two things happen in order to reduce the population. One, you reduce the number of people who go in. And we've been very successful in doing that. That population has come down 20%, while the crime rate has also come down in the last 4 years. And we do that in a whole array of ways that, the proof is in the pudding. But the second thing is, so what do we do with respect to people charged with violent offenses who stay for long periods of time? The answer that the city has is we're not releasing them. They're going through the same process, but we must speed up the way in which justice is delivered in this city. For every person, for every day that we can cut off case delay, we save 100 beds. But the courts have to kick in, the prosecutors have to kick in, the defenders have to kick in, and we have to raise the bar of justice while we ensure that we deliver it in a way that is speedy.
Good. Elias, and then we'll hear from Councilman Williams, and we'll move on to the next point.
I understand what Ms. Glazer just said, and this is the problem. The only thing that we are hearing about is New York City correctional officers. She said what she said, but who's talking about the district attorneys?
That's right.
Who's talking about the judges in the court system? Everyone is only focusing on and talking about corrections and correction officers as if we are the one who put these people in our custody. If we took custody of 65,000 New Yorkers last year, we don't have 65,000 people in our custody. That's the revolving door that goes on. But there is no panel. Every panel that I've seen, every advocate that I hear, they're not talking about the district attorneys. They are not talking about the judges who are giving these sentences. They're only talking about what happens when they get to corrections. And I absolutely stand by what I say. Corrections is the last stop on the criminal justice train. We are the last stop. It does stop with us. I get what Powers is saying, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're not here to talk about what happens after they go back into the street. We're talking about the New York City Department of Corrections and what's happening with us. The average inmate, we know, stays in this custody for about 60 days. So out of the 65,000 people that was in our custody, most of them are there 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months. They don't stay in our custody. But we have to talk about the safety. We cannot continue to talk about corrections and not talk about safety. Matter of fact, we can't talk about corrections and not talk about safety. We have to talk about safety. The funeral that I went to yesterday, like I said, in Pennsylvania, that correctional officer was kicked and stomped to death by an 18-year-old inmate. A year ago, the correctional officer that was killed in Delaware was killed by a bunch of inmates. And the same thing that was going on in Delaware and the same thing that's going on in Pennsylvania is going on here. And the union is saying we're going to end up in the same situation if we don't address safety, if we don't stop this nonsense about how long it's going to take to close the jail down. I don't care whether it's going to take a year or 2 years. What I care about is, can my officers come to work and go home the way they came? Can the inmates who get arrested go home the way they came? That's my concern. Can the civilian who got 5 of his teeth knocked out by another 18-year-old, can that civilian go home the way they came to work? And the problem is, again, no one wants to talk about what it is that we have to do with this population of inmates. We have to do something about them, and you have to give us. We should not have to beg. We should not have to beg the city council We shouldn't have to beg the mayor to give us back or give us the tools that we need. Listen, personal note. For me, I went to testify before the Assembly in Auburn, real quick. And I explained to the Black and Puerto Rican caucus that I was testifying before, that I have a sister, a baby sister, who's a New York City correction officer. And I have a son who's a correction officer. And I have a nephew and a brother-in-law who's a correction officer. But my youngest brother and my oldest brother are inmates. I don't want my mother, aunt, anybody getting a call about any of them, whether they're, regardless of what they're behind the bars for. So the union has been the only one calling for safer jails and doing this in a safer manner. So forgive my, what do you call it?
Your passion, yeah.
Passion. Forgive my passion. But I have to be passionate because every night I go to sleep and I don't sleep well. Because I don't want the call that one of my guys have been killed because you people are not doing what you're supposed to do for us.
Final point on that question from Councilman Williams, and we'll move on.
Yeah, but so one, I always want to make sure, I mean, there's something that I disagree with Elias on, but the main point about there are real people being killed and hurt, including corrections officers, should not be lost on anyone. So we should not demonize everybody. There is a system in place that encourages that. And so that's a problem for me. When I've spoken to him personally, he doesn't feel he's at the table enough. And so again, I hope that the city will reach out and make sure he is there because they are in danger, just like the inmates are in danger because of the way the system is. But I just wanted to be clear, what happened with those charges is what commonly happens. There was a dehumanization of the people we are talking about, referred to as widgets and inmates and what has happened to them before. And I'm gonna say that because there are some DAs that I think never saw a system that locked up black and brown people enough that they didn't like, and I think the Queens DA is one of them. I don't know this particular senior DA, so I can't say anything about it. But those type conversations, I think, take us backwards. We need that information, I will say that. But we need to say it in a human way to understand what happens to human beings, as Elias was pointing out, what happened to them before they got there, why there's such repeating, why no one stepped in with any type of restorative justice or other ways. The problem is we come in with the mindset that everybody needs to be in jail. The answer for all of these things are locking people up. That's the type of thing that we have to reverse. Unfortunately, doing that is a difficult task. And with respect to my colleague, Councilmember Holden, the reason he's here is because my former colleague, Councilmember Crowley, supported the plan for Rikers Island and was punished for that. We have to start rewarding people who are trying to change the dynamic and the discussion. So to say cutting this in half is irresponsible, I think itself is irresponsible because we're not discussing whether or not these folks should be in jail or not. We're talking about a number. There are other things that can be done, even with some of those people who we dehumanized on that chart. As was mentioned, some of them are going to smaller jails, just not Rikers. There's also ankle braces and other things that can happen. So I just want to start from the framework of let's just agree at some point that not everything needs to be answered by more prison, by more arrests. And I think that helps keep everyone safe when we take law enforcement in jail and make sure it's not synonymous with public safety. The public safety is a much broader discussion.
And we had a comment about the Queen's DA's office, so James Quinn, if you want to respond.
Councilman, I have been an assistant DA for 40 years. I was sat with more women of color to explain to them how the justice system works and what they have to do because their son or their daughter was murdered. I'm about to start a trial of a woman who was 9 months pregnant, a woman of color who was stabbed by her boyfriend. She was 9 months pregnant. Both she and the baby were murdered. The case was reversed. It happened 10 years ago. I've been working for the last month on putting that case together to get it to trial. Don't tell me that my system, my office, or me are insensitive to putting people in jail.
You are insensitive.
We have.
I've been black for 41
Councilman,
years.
you don't know anything
and
about
I want
me.
to tell you.
You know nothing about
that
me, Councilman.
I've worked with more mothers who have children who have died by gun violence, whether it's people who look like them or police officers. I'm telling you, when you look and talk to victims, the biggest thing they want is for it not to happen to someone else. But what you do is use their pain to help lock up other black and brown
Councilman,
people.
you have no idea what you're talking about
I
when
have
you're talking
a
about
lot
my
of idea
office.
what I'm talking
And with
about.
all due respect, Councilman, we have 30 different alternative sentencing programs in my office.
I appreciate that.
We have dozens of
Your
people.
presentation was insensitive
No,
and
my
dehumanizing.
presentation was factual,
I'm gonna
Councilman.
have to
understand
jump in.
It was
I think-
factual.
I understand that.
Excuse me.
I'm
Panelists,
sorry, I just
please.
have to say something.
We're gonna move on to
But
the
wait,
next
no,
point.
John, I just have to say something. The same thing that Jelani is saying that is being done to the people or inmates on these posters is exactly what they're doing to New York City correctional officers. Look, at the end of the day, this debate about, listen, in the black community, we have crime.
That's right.
And we have criminals, and they should be in jail, and we should do something with them. So I don't want to sit here, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm under the impression that because the people in jail are black, that they don't belong there because they're black. Listen, in the black community, we are victims of people who commit crimes, and something should be done with them. I don't think, not in defense of Quinn, but I don't think he's the one who invented the laws. I think the city council make laws. I think that the assembly and the senate make laws, and I think they're there like us to enforce those laws. So at the end of the day, we have to be cognizant of the fact that everybody in jail is not a choir boy.
The DA
And a
has the
lot of
number
them,
one
Jelani, that's
position
there
in
belong
how those
there.
laws are applied. Let's just be clear. The DA is probably the strongest person that can deal with this. I agree there is
They
crime.
get their laws and their rules from you guys.
I agree that there is crime in the black community. It is how we deal with that crime is the question. So,
Moving forward,
but we can point to any one person or any one incident to prove our point.
Sorry.
I know, but I just want to talk about a system in.
Councilman, I'm gonna,
Sure.
cut this off, move on. There are two more points that I wanted to cover, then we'll see if we have time for questions from the audience. The borough president made an interesting point about if you were to close Rikers and move it to these 4 borough-based facilities, how you avoid transferring the same problems, the same culture. And Councilman Holden talked about, should we explore rebuilding on Rikers Island? Why isn't that being part of the discussion? So I'd like to ask Elizabeth, how do you avoid that? It's the same, many of the same inmates, many of the same correction officers. How do you avoid transferring that culture? And to what degree is it also a structural problem?
Right, this isn't just about building buildings. As I said at the very beginning, something different has to happen inside. And there are a lot of people doing a lot of work on this, from the officers to the staff to the mayor to the council to make that happen. Whether it's physical improvements or adding 5 hours a day of programming or addressing needs of the officers. Of course, more must be done, but there does have to be a critical shift in what happens inside in order to make sure that we're not simply relocating the same issues that we're dealing with now on Rikers Island.
So shouldn't you revamp the courts first before you announce we're going to close Rikers and reduce the population to 5,000 without first addressing the courts, the problems in the courts, the length of time that people have to be incarcerated?
I think it has to happen all simultaneously. If it doesn't, if what we're doing is going to do everything sequentially, we will never get there. And so we are addressing the problems in the courts. Right now, there's been for 2 or 3 years a very focused effort on reducing that length of stay. There's been a big reduction in the number of people who stay for very long periods of time at Rikers. But there needs to be a much more systemic look at why it is folks who are there for those shorter periods are staying for as long. And that's a big issue. But all these things have to happen at once. There are a lot of issues here. It's a big and complicated problem, and we have to fire on every cylinder to address them.
And I have one more question before we'll go to questions from the audience. Our staff will be carrying cards around. If you want a card, just raise your hand. You can write down your question, and we'll again try to get to at least a couple of them. My next point is, we heard some discussion about the move to these borough-based facilities. Obviously, there are already existing sites in Manhattan, from Brooklyn. We heard from Elias about some of the violence at those sites. I wonder if we could hear more about those locations. Are they more up to date? What is the situation? Is it better? Is it worse than Rikers Island? And again, Elizabeth, if you could start, and then maybe a couple others on that front.
Sure, so these are old facilities, built in an old way. They are not as up to date as they should be. They don't have opportunities for programming or the right kind of space for staff. And we're engaged in a very intense process right now, and there are a number of people in the audience engaged in that. Liz Gaines, Stanley Richards, a whole host of folks. In order to figure out what the spaces look like, what needs to be done in each site, what the options are, and crucially, to be able to engage with neighborhoods and elected officials in order to do this process together. So this is something that has to happen with everyone, with officers, with staff, with neighborhoods, but that's exactly the issue before us right now.
And we need to really look at, how do we reshape these facilities? And I think about Brooklyn House of Detention, where we can restructure, and that's important to do. And so we can't just close any facility and expect to move into this existing footprint. It's not the right footprint to do so. And I think that you saw some of the interactions here. There are several schools of thought of public safety. And the first art of addressing this is that we have to listen to each other. We have to first seek to understand, then to be understood. We cannot dig in like many people have on both sides of this issue. We've dug in, we're not even hearing each other. And we need to take a moment, we need timeouts, and say, how do we do this together? No one in this room wants to see an innocent person harmed. It doesn't matter if it's the innocent person is a correction officer, an inmate, or a civilian. But when we become just as belligerent and believe our position is the only position, we're never going to get to the place that we ought to believe, because our life experiences is going to give us different approach to this concept, and the life we live is going to give us a different approach. Let's have real civil conversations on how to do this the right way. There are no bad guys in here. They're different philosophy based on lifestyle and based on what we have encountered. And that is the only way we're going to get to the solution of this, not to try to demonize each other in the process. Enough demonization takes place on our streets and in our jails. Those of us who are here to serve and protect should not be part of that demonization.
And can I
Councilman Powers?
Yeah, can I just add that, and I wanted to share the thoughts from the borough president, which is that, and I think Councilmember Holden mentioned that we might have different ideas of where the jail should go, stay or don't, but Councilmember Borelli, Councilmember Holden, myself, and many others, bipartisan, are at just sign on to a letter to advocate for more safety measures in through body scanners and other ways through Albany. I think if we committed ourselves, as much as we are committing to the closure of Rikers Island, which I am committed to actually enacting the reforms that we talked about also that are much needed in Albany, whether it's about trials or bail reform, and everybody up here I think has sort of said and agreed on the fact that there are other things beyond Rikers Island that are necessary in order to address our criminal justice system and ensure safety. If we all commit ourselves to that as well, I think we will see significant progress. I would admit, I think that the Rikers Island thing has taken up a big part of the conversation about what's going on right now, and in fact, safety and security needs and ensuring that people that perhaps don't belong there don't end up there is a really big part of that conversation. So everybody who's talking about Rikers Island needs to also be committed to all these other issues that will ensure that the people in there are safe, that the people working there are safe. And I'd like to see out of this room today and everybody up here some consensus on a few ideas, even in Albany or in the city, that we can even agree on. that it's about safety and security, that we can move forward and all advocate together, because the closure of Rikers Island is important. It's important to me and to some others, but ensuring that all these other things happen, and Councilmember Holden brings up a good point, which is we have to be advocating for these other things as well. That's got to be part of the conversation now, and should be part of the conversation in addition to what we're talking about at Rikers Island.
Sure, and one follow-up on that, with these existing facilities in Manhattan and Brooklyn, I wonder if that's kind of like a test case for these supposed problems that you would have of citing borough-based facilities. Are there problems? Is there a security issue? Is it more about property values? Any thoughts on that front?
So one, nobody wants a jail next to them primarily. There's certain things people just don't want next to them. I might feel uncomfortable if there's a jail put next to me. That doesn't mean we should not move forward. And so one of the things I want to make sure happens is that communities are more engaged in discussion. I've seen not just from shelters to everything. I think sometimes it's imposed without a discussion. So I do want to see a better discussion with these communities before we just jump in, with the understanding that if everybody says no, it won't happen. And so that those two things have to be understood. It shouldn't be just imposed, it should be discussion, but it has to happen. And just to respond, I do agree with a lot of what just said, my colleague and the board president, but I do want to point out, at the same time I want to point out, there are some philosophies that have disabused black and brown communities for a very long time. Those philosophies, I don't know how much respect to put into it. So I just want to rehumanize a certain population. We've treated them a certain way. I don't know Mr. Quinn, so I can't personally say anything. I have watched the DA from Queens for a long time, and just not impressed in terms of how to reverse systemic and historic things that have happened in particular communities.
And we are over the time limit. Are all the panelists able to stay for 5 or 10 more minutes to take audience questions? If anyone needs to leave for another commitment, feel free to go.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes? We'll do 5 minutes. Okay, and we could go another hour with all the questions I have here, but from a correction officer, what is the destiny of correction officers who rely on their career to support their family while drastic reform is happening? 10,000 correction officers won't fit in 5 small facilities in New York City.
So I do want to be clear also. I know a lot of corrections officers as well, and they are often afraid. I don't want to see anyone hurt. And I want to make sure we elevate the correction officer's voice in this, because violence is violence, as I said, and I know many folks. I don't want inmates hurting each other. I don't want the numbers lessened. I don't want, it's a disservice not to get this right and put corrections officers in there to try to fix things that need a complex fix. So I just want to say that. I'm not sure, and the corrections officers are not going to be happy, I'm not sure if job preservation is a paramount. I want there to be job preservation, but I think safety and the best way to do this has to be what we look at first. And then try to figure out, I don't want anyone to lose their jobs, particularly as a union, as was mentioned, as black and brown. So we have to think about that. But I think we have to think about how to do this the best way we can in terms of making correction officers and inmates safe.
Okay, another question. There are currently pretrial justice packages in Albany from Cuomo, the Senate Dems, and Assembly addressing bail, speedy trial, and discovery. Advocates are supporting changes with an eye to reducing the pretrial population in jails. What are you all doing to support these measures? And I'd also be curious, how likely do you think these are to pass? And Councilman Borelli, you've spent some time in Albany. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think what goes unsaid oftentimes is that many of the inmates are using the criminal justice system to delay their own trials and inadvertently extending their own time on Rikers Island. I'm sure Mr. Quinn could probably back me up on that. Should we have a shorter period through discovery, through trials, through the plea portion of any defendant's process? Certainly. Should it come at the expense of potentially denying someone their due process? I'm not sure. So I'm not sure. I don't know where the Senate Republicans go with this, primarily because I don't know if the Senate Republicans will be in the majority tomorrow, never mind next week. I think that is the entity that is preventing this from going forward. So other than reading the tea leaves there, I'm not really sure.
Yeah, and just because I commented on this, I think in the council side, we've tried to prioritize. We do a budget, we do a response to Albany on priorities that we'd like to see passed, and I asked for a number of these to be included in our package: the body scanners bill, the speedy trial, and the bail reform. So I think on the council side, we advocate, but we can only ask for, we can ask, but that doesn't mean we're guaranteed. From, do I think they'll all be passed? I think probably not, because at the end of the day, this becomes a three-person negotiation, or a four-person negotiation around these. I hope that we will see some reforms made, and bills that would guarantee the safety of the correction officers and inmates should be no-brainers.
And then just two final questions from the audience. What can be done to physically design safer correctional facilities?
I mean, I'll start with that. You know, visiting Rikers and seeing many of the different prisons, you know, this is going to sound ridiculous, but you can watch a prison show on TV and just with the naked eye, not even being an expert, see how in a place that's as dated as some of the jails on Rikers, there's more interaction between correction officers and inmates. And when you look at the incident that occurred and the attack on Jean Souffrant, lessening the likelihood that there could be 4 inmates in a sealed environment with someone who's potentially going to be the victim of attack would make the jail safer. You know, that should be the major focus of the discussion on how to rebuild jails. That shouldn't be the secondary or tertiary concern. That should be the number one concern. And I think anyone, whether you're on the right or left, would be in favor of that. And that's why even when I started out, I started out by saying I'm not opposed to closing Rikers Island for the sake of closing Rikers Island. I just think the priority needs to be on ensuring that the jails are built in a modern style with safety measures that reduce the impact on correction officers.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
There should be an inclusion of, we got to really think outside the box. Some of the stuff they're doing in Pennsylvania, where they're looking at how giving inmates a nutrition-based diet, how it has altered behavior on what we're feeding, and how it assists in the development of a person. And so we need to go across the country and look at best practices. What are other people doing in a humane fashion to ensure that a person who commits some form of violent action is able to serve his time with a level of dignity? They don't come out more broken than when they went in. And so I think there's other states that are doing it the right way. We have not. We have done it the wrong way for far too many years. And in Albany, if you're looking for the cavalry to come, let me just give you the sad reality, it's not. Even if the Democrats take control of the Senate, you still have within the Democratic conference a fraction who don't believe in, you know, some of this reform. You know, they represent
Keep it real.
where they don't. So I don't see anything coming out of Albany in the area of bail reform, in the area of prison reform. I don't see anything coming out of Albany that's going to assist in any way on what we're attempting to do here in the city. If we can't do it on our own, don't expect for it to happen. Albany's not a place that is going to happen.
All right, Elias, and then Councilman Holden.
I think what's important is, I just came back, like I said, from Pennsylvania. The funeral of a correction officer who was killed or murdered by an inmate. I think what people need to understand is wherever you go in this country, wherever we have jails and prisons, we have violence. And the reality is the design of the jail is not what determines whether it's going to be a safe jail or not. Inmates, officers, everybody have to have the understanding that crime will not be tolerated. Everybody have to understand that there are rules and that rules have to be followed. So regardless of the design of the jail in Pennsylvania is designed, it's a much newer jail, but it didn't stop this inmate from stomping this correction officer out to death. The jail in Delaware is a much newer jail, but it didn't stop those inmates from almost decapitating that correction officer. So most of the areas where they have low level of violence, the inmates, the officers, everybody understand the consequences of not following the rules or obeying the law. And I think that that's something that we here just cannot ignore. We can't ignore that everyone have to understand that there are consequences regardless of the design of the jail.
So,
You're not gonna design a jail where I'm not gonna have any contact with an inmate.
Sir, Councilman Holden.
Yes, but the reality here, though, is if you're modernizing a facility, you need more space. You need, if you go onto Rikers, you see how tight the quarters are. You look at the situation that the corrections officers have to go into the facility. I think, Elijah, you talked about the LA County's jail, how the actual corrections officers really don't come into contact that much, and they're safer. But Rikers, and again, I haven't heard an argument. Everybody's saying close Rikers. Well, rebuild Rikers. You have the space.
Yes.
In the borough-based, you don't have the space. Nobody's talking about that. You don't have space in Kew Gardens, period. You don't have space for the parking. You don't have space for, it's congested now there. Rikers, on the other hand, 414 acres. I just can't understand while under the banner close Rikers, rebuild Rikers. Rebuild it to a modern facility where everyone is safer and it's a better environment for all. I mean, that makes sense, I think. Thank you.
So, well, I just want to say I've never been a corrections officer and I've never been an inmate of Rikers. And so I try to defer to voices that have been there. So I respect Eli's voice a lot and other corrections officers that take time to hear what is being said. And so what I would say in terms of what Rikers look like is I think at the top of it, we do have to make sure that we are humanizing people. And so if the layout can help lead to that, then that's what we have to look at. If there's a place that's off to the side that no one thinks about, that's donk dank, it doesn't help humanize. So whatever can help humanize in whatever shape, and including correction officers, I do want to humanize them as well, coming to do their job, to feed their families, and they just want to get home. And so that's a voice that I think is important. But in humanizing, we have to remember, young black and brown people aren't born genetically predisposed to crime or genetically uneducable. And so the question of why the high percentage of them are there has to be answered as well before we get to corrections officers, before we even get to Rikers. I also hope I think we should rename Rikers. That's another debate, and it's not a corrections. We have to rename that as well. But with that said, it's important that we have those discussions. I do think we have to listen more. But whatever we can do to humanize people, even quote unquote criminals, because once you can't hurt people unless you dehumanize them. And so the language you use describing people who are in Rikers or people who are in this system and either side, once you're using language that is less than humanizing, then you can do a lot of things to those people and not feel bad, and that is important.
All right, that's a good note to close on. We are out of time, but this is a passionate discussion, a robust discussion. Let's give our panel a hand.
I didn't lose the crowd.